Good afternoon. I'm Nancy Inman, president of Albemarle Garden Club, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to day 2 of Olmsted Forum. Yesterday, Olmsted Forum kicked off with Genius of Place, an ode to Frederick Law Olmsted. This was an entirely virtual flower show, conceived and flawlessly executed by Fran Carden and Claire Mellinger. The show features over 100 exhibitors from around the country. If you have never seen or been to a flower show, I highly recommend this innovative flower show platform. There were entries from Seattle to Connecticut, and the show essentially had a zero carbon footprint. This may be the flower show of the future. The show will be available for viewing on our website soon, albemarlegardenclub.com. Last night, we had a reception planned by Pam Edmonds at the beautiful Fralin Art Museum. I would like to now hand it over to Kim Corey and Dana Harris, the co-chairs of Olmsted Forum.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Nancy. Hello, and thank you all for joining us today at the Olmsted Forum. I apologize if any of you got some sort of computer-generated email saying that the forum was canceled. That was a little technical error on our front, but as you can see, we are not canceled. So thank you for being here. I'd like to voice our appreciation before all of you to Beth Meyer. She is the founder for the Center for Cultural Landscape Studies here at UVA, former dean of the School of Architecture, and a current professor. Beth was my first phone call upon thinking that Olmsted might be a good topic for an Albemarle Garden Club design forum. It was her proof of concept and academic bona fides that gave this event life. Thank you, Beth. Last night, we presented Beth with the Garden Club of America Civic Improvement Commendation, and the citation for that award reads, "In appreciation for her many contributions to the success of Olmsted Forum, which furthers the understanding of Olmsted's legacy and supports our civic projects." Congratulations, Beth. The next person I would like to thank, unfortunately, is not here today, but if Beth was my first phone call, Dee Dee Petri was my second. Dee Dee was one of our earliest supporters. And as many of you know, Dee Dee is a past president of the Garden Club of America, and she is the current executive director of the National Association of Olmsted Parks. The Garden Club of America is a proud supporter of the NAOP's multifaceted celebration of Olmsted 200. And although Dee Dee couldn't be here today, she did send us a brief presentation from the NAOP that we, with Dick's technical expertise, we're going to share with you now.
Other thank yous that we are so grateful to be able to express are to our sponsors and patrons. Your strong support of our event is so appreciated. And to everyone in the room that has bought a ticket to our events, thank you also. It is this financial support that will allow us to continue and enhance our work in the community, and especially at the Bog Garden at Booker T. Washington Park here in Charlottesville. Melville Krebs and I have been the chairs of the Bog Garden for the past 4 years, and it is so exciting and gratifying for us to see how this place is newly embraced by our club and by our community. I'm really excited to explore the Bog Garden through the lens of Olmsted today and with the perspective of our speakers this afternoon. And now I'm going to hand the program over to Beth.
So grateful to our friends at the Albemarle Garden Club, and I want to underscore for those of you who are students in the room, the role that they have played in incredible preservation and advocacy efforts. I first met Dee Dee, who they mentioned, when I was on the Commission of Fine Arts, and the Garden Club of America was quite concerned about Big's master plan for the Smithsonian and its disregard for the historic landscape. And in their quiet but extremely persuasive way, they were able to turn that project around. Never underestimate someone from the Garden Club. Dee Dee, for instance, is Harvard class of 77 and Harvard Law. They are powerhouses in every way, and we're lucky to have them as collaborators. For those of you who are trying to figure out the logistics of where folks are, Sarah Cedar Miller is with us from New York. And if you turn around and wave to the blue light, she'll feel like she's at home. It's up at the top by the ceiling. Yeah. Sarah Zodi will be with us in a few minutes. She's jamming in Zoom meetings today and knows that she'll be on call at 3 o'clock. And then Susan and John are here with me on the stage, and our fearless leader, Dick, of course, by our side. So I want to welcome everybody here back to physical events in Campbell Hall. And on behalf of the Center for Cultural Landscapes that Jessica Sewell and the planning faculty and I co-direct, we want to say that we're thrilled to be gathering at the beginning of a year of academic and professional events that mark the 200th anniversary of Frederick Law Olmsted's birth. I want to share with you the premise of our events today, and then offer a few introductions to our speakers to set the stage. Some of you have read these online, some of you have not. Some of you have had time to look at the pre-recorded lectures, and some have not. So I've asked the speakers in the first few minutes that they speak to just give you a little like 5-minute cliff notes of their lecture so that everybody feels like we're on the same page as we start the discussion. So how to get started? When architect Calvert Vaux and landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. designed Central Park, Olmsted, unlike Vaux, brought no credentials or professional design experience to the collaboration. Yet he was an astute observer and connoisseur of landscapes, including gardens, parks, plantations, and scientific farms. Having traveled to England and throughout the American South during the 1850s, his observations are recorded for us in numerous texts, including the Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, in his field reports for the New York Daily Times, now known as the New York Times, and then those reports later collected in several books, culminating in the Cotton Kingdom. I became aware of his work in a visceral way when I was given this in 1993. The last time I saw my students at Harvard before I came to Charlottesville to join this faculty. I remember being a little, I don't know, peeved, like they somehow thought going to the South was going back to the 1860s. It's a copy, actually an original, of a journal, A Journey in the Backcountry by Frederick Law Olmsted from the 1860s. But I have to admit that it really struck me at the time. And I remember thinking, somebody needs to do something with this. And so thank goodness John and Sarah have. But let me just read a few passages so you get a sense of his eye reading the landscape. For some miles about St. Francisville, the landscape has an open suburban character with residences indicative of rapidly accumulating wealth and advancement in luxury among the proprietors. For 20 miles to the north of the town, there is on both sides a succession of large sugar and cotton plantations. Much land still remains uncultivated, however. The roadside fences are generally hedges of roses, Cherokee and sweetbriar. They are planted first by the side of the common rail fence, which while they are young supports them in the manner of a trellis. And as they grow older, they fall away and mat together, finally forming a confused, sprawling, slovenly thicket, often 10 feet in breadth and 4 to 6 feet high. Trumpet creepers, grapevines, greenbriers, and in very rich soil, cane grow up through the mat of roses and add to its strength. It is not as pretty as a trimmer hedge, yet very agreeable, and the road being sometimes narrow, deep, and lane-like, delightful memories of England were often brought to mind. There were frequent groves of Magnolia grandiflora, large trees, and everyone in the glory of full blossom. He goes on to talk about the large leaf magnolia, extremely beautiful, was more rarely seen. The next passage moves on to the plantations, where he talks not only about the soil, but the labor. First came, led by an old driver carrying a whip, 40 of the largest and strongest women I have ever seen together. They were all in simple uniform dress of bluish check stuff, the skirts reaching little below the knee, their legs and feet were bare. They carried themselves loftily, each having a hoe over the shoulder. Behind them came the cavalry. A lean and vigilant white overseer on a brisk pony brought up the rear. The men wore small blue Scotch bonnets, many of the women handkerchiefs, turban fashion, and a few nothing at all on their heads. The reason I'm sharing this level of description is for you to understand how extremely carefully Olmsted was looking at both the physical landscape and the labor that shaped it. His accounts tell us a lot about the way he travels, not only from here to the south, but how those travels connect him to his travels in England. And for us to appreciate the landscape education he gleaned before he became a landscape architect from his varied experiences. So what we are really excited about doing today is examining the influence of these travels and landscape experiences on not only his park design, but how they intersected with conceptions of nature, national identity, race relations, and public health crises. We aspire to expand our appreciation of the connections between these endeavors and their impact on Olmsted's parks and their legacy today in terms of the entanglements we understand between race, space, urban life, and democracy. Collectively, our speakers will help us identify Olmsted's evolving recognition that landscape is a material, it's a milieu, and an experience that's a potent medium for constructing social relations in urban space, a topic as germane today as it was a century ago. A couple of things that we asked the speakers to think about as we organized the event was to think about the kinds of landscape experiences Olmsted chronicled and recorded and why they were compelling. If they could ascertain his shifting landscape preferences and aesthetics in relationship to his conceptions. Hi, other Sarah, good to see you. His conceptions of slavery, racial capitalism, and democracy. And then to think about how the cultural landscape practices that Olmsted saw in the field and translated into design experiences might inspire us today or actually suppress our capacity today. A few things about our speakers beyond what you might know from the website. And I'll start briefly with park advocate, administrator, author, and consultant, Susan Rademacher. Her overview entitled An Overture to Olmsted's Life and Legacy was remarkable. In 25 minutes, she included key moments that shaped Olmsted's landscape experience. And she has a rare gift as a public scholar to synthesize dozens, if not hundreds, of books for those of us in the audience who are still learning about Olmsted's legacy and to translate that into accessible and beautiful prose. Another important contribution comes from art historian and landscape historian Sarah Cedar Miller. in her talk on Central Park before Olmsted. And Sarah's talk reminds us that Olmsted's aesthetic preferences were informed by not only his early travels and his reading and his education, but by the very site that he worked on. His canvases were full. They were already marked. Unlike a painter who starts on a blank slate, Olmsted worked on sites that were already marked through geological processes, hydrological processes, and in the case of Central Park, the incredible detective work that Sarah's been doing to understand the varied settlement patterns that included farms, small communities, and even really ooky glue. I don't know how that glue gets made, but I know horses are burned and something. She'll tell you more about that. So from Sarah, we understand that the site was a framework and an armature, an already marked canvas, an important pre-existing condition for Olmsted and Vaux. Environmental and architectural historian and educator John Dean Davis is no stranger to this room. He spent 4 years attending lectures in this place as an undergrad in the architecture school. And his scholarship on Olmsted in the South and Olmsted at War relates to his bigger research on the role of the Corps of Engineers and civil engineering in the shaping of the public landscape of America. He provides us with a surprising chapter into Olmsted's career, his travels through the Southern landscape as a public health administrator during the Civil War and as a journalist. And he allows us to understand that the landscape for Olmsted was not just what it looked like, but how it was shaped through systems of labor and systems of warfare, from the logistics of violence and surveillance on plantations to that on battlefields and in military hospitals. He reminds us that Olmsted's landscape experiences included observations about how landscapes are shaped by organization through logistics and technology. And then finally, Sarah Zodi, a landscape architect and educator, retracing Olmsted travel through the American South. Many of you know that Zodi's research and progress is structured along the itinerary that Olmsted took through the South in the mid-1850s. Through her close reading of texts and contexts, Olmsted's writings and the specific sites he visited afford us insights into the conditions of slavery and their traces and patterns in the landscape. They also reveal Olmsted's sense of slavery's corrupting impact on the enslavers and the Southern culture in general. I see two other contributions that Sarah's talk affords contemporary landscape architects and advocates of landscape. And I'd like to note them as they may set the scene for the first interactions between our speakers. Our reassessment of Olmsted today says much about our need to rewrite the histories of landscape architecture as they intersect with political history, environmental and social history, with our nation's racialized divide. But it also suggests that this interrogation into our profession's founding myths, our origin stories, may allow us to fully embrace and live up to the breadth of Olmsted's aspirations as an American citizen, a writer, a designer, and a dreamer of a better future. I mentioned that I'm going to ask each of the speakers to share a few key insights or points from their lectures that they want you to remember. Some may say that in a sentence, some in a couple of paragraphs. And from that, I'll start with some questions to get conversation going. And then we'll also open the conversation up to everyone in the audience. And our fantastic Brown Fellow this year at the Center for Cultural Landscape, Natalie Chavez, will help Dick with a microphone for questions. Keep in mind that we'll be recording, and the recording of this session will be available in a couple of days on the center's website, and I hope also on the website for the event through the Garden Club. Great. Susan, can I put you on the spot to start with an?
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here at the University of Virginia and with the Albemarle Garden Club for this, what is a fascinating combination of speakers and a deeper dive into aspects of Olmsted than I have experienced before. So thank you and kudos to the organizers. My task was to provide an introduction to Olmsted, at which I quailed. Because anyone who's done any diving into Olmsted knows that there are scores of ways that a person can approach that man's work and life. Lots of ways to get at it and lots to explain and some interesting mysteries. You talked about myths, Beth. One of the myths or common assumptions that I've often seen is the discomfort that scholars have with Olmsted's life before he became a landscape architect, and calling him footloose and a vagabond, and he didn't know what he was going to do, and he failed at this and he failed at that. Well, in fact, what I see is a very deliberate act of self-education that started when he was being schooled as a teenager by ministers, and continued all of his life. Even at the very end of his life, he admitted that he didn't learn as much about plants as he wished he had when he was urging his son Rick to do so. So the deliberate education and accumulation of knowledge across so many fields and the integration of that into what became the practice of landscape architecture is quite fascinating. Another is his approach to design. As a parks person and a landscape person, I'm really excited about immersive experience in nature and in design or through design into the landscape and the transformative possibilities that affords. And so to me, the two important points aesthetically about Olmsted are, one, that he regarded landscape architecture as different from landscape gardening because landscape architecture entails creating a whole composition in which every element has its place and nothing is out of place. And of course, that level of control really can't be executed in a public park, I'm here to tell you, over time. But again, the aspiration and the sense of the landscape as a work of art that's meant to be dived into, explored, experienced as through passages of scenery that afford you all the things that you need in a public space: solitude and restoration and calm, important tete-a-tetes, social activities, sporting activities, the big civic gatherings. The genius of his approach to design is that he was able to organize all of that infrastructure that supported our ability to go into these landscapes and took us through these scenic passages in a way that is subsumed by the scenery. So all of that infrastructure doesn't overwhelm the experience of that landscape. And that's quite remarkable, and I think worth studying in great detail. Path alignments, all kinds of small details. And that was the other thing about Olmsted, is a complete attention at every scale to everything that mattered in his ability to encompass all of that. Yeah.
Sure. One thing about sitting in the front of this room is I realized that when I fell asleep in the back of the room, it was definitely visible. So I'm an environmental and engineering historian, and I work on the 19th century Americas. And so the big change that happens that makes the modern United States that we live in, is the Civil War and Reconstruction. It's this massive fight, but then also a complete transformation of the economic and political life of the United States. You have this translation from a kind of vastly modernizing capitalism in the South that's based on human enslavement into a Yankee Northern industrial vision. And Olmsted is like the Forrest Gump of this. He's there at all of the major points of it. He's in the South. He sees what's happening in the South. He reports it in an unsensationalized way. And then he's in the war also. He's part of McClellan's ill-fated Peninsular Campaign in Virginia. And these experiences more than shaped him as a kind of designer. He was, as Beth says, an incredibly perceptive person, just incredibly perceptive. And he saw big, deep structural changes happening in the United States. And he saw that those changes weren't necessarily foregone conclusions, that they needed to be worked on. They needed to be organized in a certain way. So he goes into the South and sees not only kind of a regime of violence where there's this huge input of energy into oppressing people essentially, but then sees what's essentially a police state. He goes to Charleston, there's military drumming, there are armed soldiers patrolling the streets, you have to have a passport to be able to go to different parts of the city. And he says that this isn't, a state of siege or a state of revolution. This is just a Tuesday in Charleston, where there's this massive apparatus that is built on top of the kind of slave capitalism that prevents any kind of civic life from emerging, any kind of civic life that he was interested in. And so he's a good Yankee capitalist. He believes that the dynamics of this economic system, but he sees in the South a kind of corrupt branch of what could happen eventually. And he comes to see the war when the war eventually does break out. And there are notes of kind of an impending crisis building in the 1850s as he's publishing these books. By the time he writes Backcountry, it's noticeable that this isn't an adventure for him anymore. This is a really kind of grim state of affairs, and he's sounding an alarm in a kind of way. When the war actually happens, he can't join the army because he was in a very bad carriage accident, so he's not fit for military duty. So he ends up joining the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which is kind of the precursor for the Red Cross. A lot of prominent New Yorkers and Northerners join this, and he organizes. Basically, they're there to organize the health and hygiene of the Union armies as they're in the field. So supplies, bedding, clothing, and then doing basic sanitary engineering in the military encampments. The war is enormous. It's the first industrialized war that the world has ever seen in its destructive capability. People had never seen anything like this happen before. Olmsted throws himself into this work with kind of a characteristic, maniacal obsession for work. I think Susan and I both picked up on working until 4 a.m. and then having a breakfast of black coffee and pickles it's a recipe for burnout, and that's what he did. And just can't. I remember reading that, being like, "Oh, I just can't even." He ends up on a hospital ship in the James River in the Peninsular Campaign in 1862, and he's on the hospital ship, and the Union Army and the Confederate Army have a kind of inconsequential battle at a place called Fair Oaks. And it's inconsequential because there's no clear winner. But what happens is, and this becomes characteristic of the war, there's no clear winner, it's inconclusive, but it produces mass casualties. And Olmsted tries to describe what it's like to see the thousands of wounded be brought to the hospital ship on the river. And he writes, probably for the first time in his life, that he's at a loss for words. This is a guy who describes everything, and he can't describe this. So what I try to argue in the lecture is there's a kind of a psychic damage that's done not only to Olmsted but to a lot of Americans. This produces a desire for stemming the tide against what could happen, the way that the world could develop. And so Olmsted's project in his life becomes kind of working against seeing this corruption happen, this infection happen to the United States. And he is wildly successful. His firm and his son's firms design everything. They're hugely successful in implementing his kind of vision of a democratic order for the Republic after the Civil War. But it's important to remember that this is very much a kind of white bourgeois vision of what the United States could or should be. And it achieves a kind of hegemony to the point where, even though it is done with good intentions, the best intentions really at heart, it has crowded out a lot of other ways of making landscapes in the United States and in the world, which is something to think about. So.
Sarah Cedar Miller, would you like to introduce your talk and some of the key points you'd like us to know?
All right, sorry to read, but I wanted to make sure that a few things I forgot in my talk, one very important one that I didn't forget. Anyway, thank you for inviting me, and it's an honor to be with such esteemed colleagues. So everyone knows about Frederick Law Olmsted's design for Central Park, which I have called the most important work of 19th century American art. Few realize, however, the challenging task that Olmsted faced as superintendent, a position he got on September 11th, 1857. His job was to supervise the clearing of the landscape that was on the fringes of the city and host to approximately 1,500 people with homes, gardens, orchards, piggeries, stables, barns, factories, churches, schools, military sites, burial grounds, woods, bogs, rocks, and hundreds of roaming animals. He also had challenging interpersonal relationships with his new boss, Lieutenant Egbert Ville, the engineer, whose design had been chosen by former commissioners who preferred to work with a practical man, as Olmsted was not to them, and who Ville saw somewhat as a dandy, a rival political appointee, and a threat. The crews also denigrated their new boss, Frederick Law Olmsted, and played practical jokes on him. He was not at all happy about this, but he whipped them into shape, not literally. And it was only when Calvert Vaux came into Olmsted's life that his career as a landscape architect really took off. Vaux, a British architect, had invited Olmsted to co-partner with him in the design competition of the new park. Prior to that invitation by Vaux, Olmsted, as superintendent, had shown absolutely no interest in the possibility of entering the competition. Olmsted rejected Vaux's invitation, as he would never step on his boss's toes any more than we would do that today. And he knew that Ville would re-enter his plan in the design competition. We know from correspondence about designing Prospect Park in Brooklyn that Vaux could and would badger Olmsted until Vaux got his way with his partner. And so in this instance, Olmsted went to Ville, probably under the pressure from Vaux, to ask if he would mind, if his boss would mind entering the competition. And Ville said, as in our modern vernacular, yeah, whatever, who cares? Never dreaming that Olmsted would ever win the design competition. It was a political appointee that the commissioners wanted a Republican, and Olmsted and Vaux were Republicans, Ville a Democrat. So that was a big part of the story that a lot of people don't talk about either. One point I forgot to mention in my presentation was Olmsted and Vaux's brilliant design concept with regards to the democratic mission of the park. Many of the elite of New York society did not wish to mix with the lower classes and were planning to come to the park only to ride in their fine carriages on the drives or on horseback. Olmsted and Vaux, understanding this problem, designed the most beautiful parts of Central Park only for pedestrians. So they figured, if you prefer to stay on the park drives in your carriage or on your horse, you would be unable to experience the most celebrated landscapes that we all love today: the mall, the woodlands, Bethesda Terrace, the lakes, the rustic summer houses on top of the rock outcrops. And so I think this is something that we no longer intuit when we're in Central Park because everybody goes everywhere. And carriage riding isn't allowed, nor is automobile riding anymore. And so we don't really understand that there would have been a real division between the lower class people who did not own a carriage or a horse and the elite who didn't want to mix with them. So that was a brilliant design decision that the two of them made, which I think is probably overlooked. Once Olmsted did win first prize with Vaux, they were up against two commissioners who preferred a totally different plan, also by a Democrat, and forced the two landscape architects to include several additions and modifications to their plan, all of them features, like the bridges, that we have come to treasure as part of Central Park today. In closing, I also mentioned the groundbreaking idea that Olmsted, by himself, later in his life, had created out of bitterness and frustration he felt as both superintendent and architect-in-chief to constantly be bombarded with requests for patronage jobs. Instead, Olmsted wanted to create a governing board that took the management of public parks away from potentially corrupt local officials and place it instead in the hands of enlightened and unpaid private citizens. He also envisioned that an expert landscape architect, like himself, would oversee the grounds and the crews. That germ of an idea was realized in Central Park in 1979 with the appointment of Elizabeth Barlow Rogers as Central Park administrator, the first person in nearly a century to manage the daily operations of Central Park. In 1980, 1 year later, a board of concerned citizens formed the Central Park Conservancy in partnership with the city of New York. Today, those public-private partnerships have changed urban parks around the country and around the world. But so few people realize that those conservancies were born out of Olmsted's frustration and disappointment in Central Park. But because of his extraordinary idea and the efforts of the Central Park Conservancy for the past 40 years, Central Park is more beautiful, better managed, safe, clean, and protected than Olmsted would ever have dreamt possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. And Sarah Zodi, do you want to share with us a couple of the key points about your talk before we go into Q&A and conversation?
Sure. I'll keep it brief so we can get to dialogue with one another. But Beth, I really appreciate the prompts that you gave us in introducing us, because I do think that the project of reclaiming our nation's history is in parallel with reclaiming the history of our own profession. And since I began this work studying specifically the period of Olmsted's life where he's traveling the South and understanding its connection to his practice, I continue to remain surprised at how much there is articulated by Olmsted himself about the relationship and how little we understand that to be a part of our story as a profession. It's a mystery to me. I find many more references, for instance, to Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, which predates Cotton Kingdom, and in fact was less historically notable, less literarily notable. It is less relevant, frankly, in Olmsted's own mind. There's of course the moment and the inspiration of Birkenhead Park, but in terms of what we call landscape architecture as a practice, as was noted, it's a practice that fashions together a number of different disciplines and skill sets. I think that really comes to the fore for Olmsted. You see him practicing that in his travels and the methodology of his writing. And so, another element of how we historicize this is we often talk about how Olmsted had, professions before becoming a landscape architect, and that there was some sort of shift that happened. But I would argue that, given the predominance of the question of slavery in his early letters, I think that's the kind of that's the thread that brings all of this together. There is a unifying kind of theme here, and it is about the crisis of slavery and the impact that it has on this country. And you know, one of the points that I make in the lecture is about the inability of the society itself to calculate properly what is good for itself. He describes owning humans as almost an inebriation. And he goes through an extensive exercise of proving both on the micro and macro scales, you know, that the economics of slavery don't hold. And at a certain point, he realizes it's actually futile, you know, and you get a sense of that by the time Cotton Kingdom comes out. It's no longer about proving anything. It's not about logics. It's not about economics, and it's not about math. And so in the introductory chapter that he writes for Cotton Kingdom, he says the only way to overcome this is war. And so he's ready for war. And so it's, you know, in tracing all of the, you know, the impacts and the influences that Olmsted notes and the ways in which they are present with us today, it begs the question of, you know, what are we still inebriated as a society? In what ways? And in fact, you know, Olmsted warns about the desperate nature of people to remain unaware of society's ills as it relates to slavery in order to keep their position in the society. And in revisiting all of the sites that Olmsted travels to, I find landscape architecture to be the tool for remaining unaware of society's ills. And so it also brings to light the question of our profession today. You know, while the Olmsted firm went on to touch 5,500 projects around North America, the original ambition of senior falls off, and it becomes landscape architecture in the last 165 years has become a tool, a technical skill set, a vocational training that doesn't include the kind of toggling of scales and of readings of landscape ecologically, politically, and socially that are important to what, you know, the profession that Olmsted invents, if we accept that, that hasn't been baked into what we've called landscape architecture since Olmsted Senior. And so, you know, thinking about the moment, the parallel moment that we live in now, I think all of those questions are at the forefront of my mind as we enter the bicentennial year. And, you know, and I pose to you all as a question going forward.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I had a sense of a question to ask to get us launched, but I have to admit feeling a little detoured by amazing things all four of you have said. So let me try to open this up in the broadest way I can, but tap into some of your comments. And I'll preface the question with a summary of two things I heard from several of you today. Olmsted is convinced that the immersive experience in nature has a transformative effect. And Susan, you talked about, and I think I got the phrase, the unbending of the mind and the body. And I think many of us have felt that during the pandemic when we've gone for long walks and found ourselves seeking places of calm, right? So he has a sense that the experience of landscape has agency. It has effects that are beyond that looks nice. It actually changes our psychology and our well-being. So that's one of his ways of valuing landscape. The other taps into something that John's talked about in terms of his writing about Olmsted's obsession with order and organization. He's appalled at the inefficiency of slavery. So separate from the morality of it, and his map, Sarah Zodi, that you've shown in your talk, right, where he's mapping wealth and whether a place is using enslaved labor or free, demonstrates that before the war, there's more wealth where there's not slavery. So he's appalled at the inefficiency of certain systems of organizing landscape or managing or making landscape. So these two ways of valuing landscape through the lens of efficiency and effects, aesthetics and technology. They seem so separate, and I'm trying to understand maybe how they're connected. And I wonder if any of the four of you have a recollection of a moment where he's writing or a place that he's visiting where he does the toggling between the person who appreciates landscape for its effects on his psyche. And John, you mentioned that horror on the James River, right? And this desire to order, organize, and be efficient. And it may be an impossible question, and yet I want to try to start there and see if any of you can share an insight into those two different ways that he values landscape.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. So the efficiency argument is interesting, and his kind of economic outlook has actually produced a ton of scholarship in American history, because he's called the architect of the economic indictment of slavery, which argues that we shouldn't do slavery because it's inefficient, or it's not a proper allocation of capital uses, and that is a privilege argument over the kind of moral argument. This is wrong to do this to kind of people. But historians have found actually that he was chasing his tail in a little bit of a way, because slavery was also changing in the 1850s. It was changing rather rapidly, where especially in the sugar producing areas in the Caribbean and in North Carolina, they were becoming incredibly highly capitalized production facilities. Absolutely brutal. And this is why, and he notices it too, where a lot of enslaved people are being sold from places like Virginia, where the soil has been exhausted, down to places where they're really intensely trying to pull out commodity crops out of the further south. He kind of misses this. But he does see again, it's this operation happening where forces are reorganizing themselves. And everyone's talking about capitalism being the reorganizing force in the 1850s. Everyone's talking about it. He talks about capital all the time, and how it is kind of still mysterious, but it has a tremendous power to organize things. And so in the North, it has organized things like New York City, which is a boom town essentially. And in the South, it's organized things that are really dark. And that's kind of what I think those are the moments that produce the kind of fear in him. And I think, yeah, as Sarasoti says, it's not about math at a certain point, because the math doesn't really work. It's more of he's perceiving a process that is ongoing, and it's not one static thing that's happening. It's about what the future could hold. I can't think of exactly a landscape where he comes to this conclusion, other than the war is cataclysmic. It's absolutely cataclysmic for a lot of people, and there is for a long time we've kind of ignored the history of emotions. We tend to think about people as being rational all the time, and there's a lot of really emotional content that's happening at this time. People are really worked up about it. I mean, there are fist fights on the floor of the Congress, right? Like, people are getting beaten for it. People are really worked up, and they have trouble articulating that a lot of the time, or they articulate it in ways that we now, from our perspective, we see them as fooling themselves or deluding themselves. But the emotions are real, and I think that his ability to kind of find that a place of relief or a place of solace and prescribe that for America at that time is, I think it's his fundamental sociological insight into the United States at the time.
Can I jump in? I think this is a great question, and that was a great set of responses, Sean. one of the things that I find really compelling about Olmsted's realizations towards the end of his trip is that, you know, he basically lays bare that the reason he's kind of focusing on the efficiency of the economy is because of the conditions of the labor that inefficiency pushes down on. And he's pretty radically tying the condition of enslaved people with poor white people in the United States. And towards the end starts not even to make the distinction in terms of how he's talking about the efficiency of the economy and you know, and even actually among people in European aristocratic societies. He's really starting to make a global argument about the economy and labor. And so for him, these inefficiencies, you know, they keep the labor from what he calls domestic happiness. And he sees landscape as a place for elevating the domestic happiness of the labor. And so for him, I mean, I think that's for me, as I hear your question, Beth, it's why is he talking about the economy? And for him, it's about the material good of the people as a whole. And that's in a direct quote. You know, thinking about the economy not as the profit of a few, but the general health and wealth, morally, intellectually, materially for the people as a whole. And so there's some pretty radical economic underpinnings to these concepts, you know, that we, you know, can appreciate as being encoded in the practice of landscape architecture.
Sarah Cedar Miller, I want to follow up to see if you've got any insights from Olmsted and Vaux's work on Bethesda Terrace after the war. So they'd won the competition, but they're continuing to work on the project during the war. And I know there's been some interpretation of the Bethesda fountain and the angel relative to this kind of healing and references to the soothing nature of landscape. Can you share with us any insights you might have about the specific design of the Bethesda Terrace and the rambles that might tap into not just individual well-being in nature, but national reconciliation or well-being through a public space like that?
Sure. Well, first of all, in the beginning, Vaux, who was the architect, considered Bethesda Terrace his masterpiece of his life. And Olmsted actually was less focused on the details of architecture and left it all to Vaux. But the earliest plans, it was very simple. There were probably no carvings planned. They were working with a different budget and much less money than they had originally planned, and much more than they originally planned. But Olmsted wasn't, he thought it was a little fussy, I have a feeling. And, but Vaux and Jacob Ray Mould did do their work. And it was originally planned to be about the 4 seasons, but it was a real encyclopedic vision of nature and art and science all coming together in this one spot that was an uplift for you intellectually as well as psychologically and morally, an education carved in stone, basically, for many people who couldn't read when they came to the park. At the time also, the nature and God were very intertwined, and certainly with the transcendentalists slightly earlier. But Olmsted has a Bible right as you walk down the steps of Bethesda Terrace. It was meant to be literally the park a religious experience. And as far as the fountain, there are recent letters that have just come to light by Emma Stebbins that her brother had died in New Orleans during a cholera epidemic. And she was really focused on the health and the purity of water, which had come to New York from the Croton water system, which was only a few blocks north of Bethesda Terrace. And originally we didn't know that her brother died of cholera, but that's undoubtedly was on her mind. She was about 15 years old when he died, and that must have stayed with her her whole life. So fresh and clean water was something that was symbolic as well as physically a reality that the park now celebrates. I hope I answered your question. About the Civil War, Bethesda Terrace was designed before, during, and after the Civil War. It's part of the only part of the park that had this complete transition. And there were references, too long to go into today, of that relate specifically to the North and the South, the conflict. And also Olmsted and Vaux really were out of the picture from 1863 when they both quit to 1865. So Jacob Ray Mould was the one who took over for the park at that time.
Great. Great. I want to follow up with, and I know, I mean, the thing about these talks, you go from the most serious and, oh my God, I'm depressed, to the most like joyful and detailed. So I don't know where I'm going to be with this next question, somewhere in between those, but it's for you, Sarah. And I mean, I've said this a couple times in different ways, but I want to underscore that I think the book that you've got in press is going to cause every historian of Central Park to have to reconsider what they thought Olmsted and Vaux were doing because of this beautiful description of what was on the site before. So I'm super interested in the before and after of one place that you talked about in your lecture. I think a lot of people in this room know about the history of Seneca Village, the free Black settlement that was on what we now would call Central Park West, somewhere around 80-ish Street, right? And I realized that the only pine grove or evergreen planting in the park was on the site of the former Seneca Village. And I mean, the pinetum today, which is a different design, but the similar character, feels sacred in a way that a lot of the rest of the park does not. And I'm just wondering, was there anything in the historical record about why a pine grove or a pinetum was located on the site of this pre-Black settlement that was cleared? Or is that just me, like, I don't know, going down a rabbit hole trying to figure out what that's about? And maybe I'll just say that there's a lot of criticism of the displacement of the park, of the community because of the park, but very little discussion of what replaced it. And so that's where my curiosity comes.
Okay, I think I can answer some of it. The pinetum actually only started in the 1970s. Before that, I forget what was there, but not much. And it is a very small part of Seneca Village, which is a much larger area between 83rd Street to 89th Street, what would have been 7th Avenue to Central Park West. So I don't know in acreage, but it was sizable. And for those of you who don't know, Seneca Village was basically, I think at that time in America, the largest African-American settlement of property owners, not just a community, but the owners of the property that had started in 1825 and lasted until they were forced to leave, like the other 1,400 people in Central Park. What I've discovered, first of all, Seneca Village this is the first time I'm telling anyone, Seneca Village is probably not at all related to a word that has anything to do with the people who live there. It is undoubtedly a term never used, ever used, really until it was published in 1873, long after the village had been disbanded, and is probably the result of two ministers who were in a missionary church with the Seneca Village residents. It's not derogatory, as I once said or thought. It could be a term I just didn't know. Seneca Indians have nothing to do with it. And in the book, I reveal how my research came to having it be called Seneca Village. Too long for this discussion. Also, my research reveals that the community received a very sizable amount of money when the city took over. It also reveals the fact that many of the people were dealing in real estate, just like white New Yorkers, and had left the community decades before. Particularly, there was a huge boom in real estate and the economy in New York in the 1834 to 1836, when most of the landowners flipped the land, got a lot of money, and sold it for the most part to other African-American people who some of the plots were exchanged 4, 5, or 6 times over the history of Seneca Village. And I think we all had the idea that people came, they bought land, they lived there, and then they were forced to leave. And the documents, I've read every deed, every will, everything possible, and I could get my hands on tax assessments, newspapers, and it's a very different story. It's actually a more entrepreneurial story of Black people trying to make their lives better by investing in land. Many of them did not live there, just invested. And even in their wills, we can see that they said, sell my land when I die, for a few, including the man who mainly owned the Pinetum. So it's a different story. And still, of course, when people lose their home, and we can say that about all the residents who did stay there, it's a tragedy, of course. Yeah, you can't get away from that. But that is the story, for better or worse, of urban America. People lose their homes for improvements.
Yeah, my colleague Lisa Goff, who teaches at UVA in American Studies, in her book on the history of shanty towns, says kick park, find a shanty town. That usually you can't separate out the displacement of communities from the construction of those kind of public works. Thanks, Sarah, for that insight into Seneca Village. Before I go to my next question, I want to get everybody in the audience thinking about questions. I've got one for John, which gets back to this concept of order. So John's essay that the talk today was based on comes out of a larger collection that Dumbarton Oaks published called Military Landscapes. And in it, John, you often talk about the word order. Olmsted's conceptions of order as they influence his reading of landscape, his understanding of logistics, and frankly, his capacity to transform hundreds of acres of site into parks. I just wonder if you can help us unpack the word order in the 19th century, the various ways that we might understand it, how you think it affects the shaping of the professions, because I would suspect, given that he learns a lot about professions from his friends like architect Henry Hobson Richardson, that the word order probably resonates with all kinds of design and engineering practices at the time.
Well, big question, but a really interesting one, and one that I don't have a definition for you right now. I think it's something that I can spend the rest of my career thinking about, and probably will. But I think that there's kind of a story with Olmsted where he takes a very aristocratic practice of building these sculpted gardens sculpted parks that are not put to agricultural use, that no one lives on, but are for everyone. And he takes this aristocratic practice and he democratizes it in a way. And he brings it to the United States, where it is shorn of its association with the manor estate and turned into an essential piece of urban furniture. And this comes from his kind of conception of order, I think. So the English landscape tradition, or one of the big kind of underpinnings of the philosophy, is this idea about nature and how nature works and what nature is. And if not to get too much into the kind of literary basis of it, but a lot of it is based on poetry that happens before the Enlightenment. Pope is one of the big figures here, where there's this idea that nature is this very big, beneficent machine, and it has its own internal logics, and it is good. It is associated with the divine, and it really is indifferent to people. That it exists for itself, and nature is a beautiful thing, and its ecology and the way that it grows and develops is it's its own kind of system, and it matters nothing to human beings, or human beings don't matter to it. They're outside of it. Olmsted doesn't see nature as this wholly other thing. He sees it as something that you can roll up your sleeves and get involved in it and tinker with it and engineer it. And I write in my paper that he's more of an engineer than a gardener in a lot of ways. He sees the benefits of nature, of being in nature, of how being in the presence of this big beneficent thing does people good. And he is not content with just putting someone in its presence. He wants to amplify those systems. He wants to magnify the kind of good order of nature, and increase its efficiency in a way. So this is what makes him kind of distinctly American. He's not interested in the aristocratic pretensions of it. He's not afraid to get his hands dirty and to tinker with something. It's not holy. It's something you can work with here. And that there's this good order is always balanced by not a void, but by the bad things that can happen that he sees in the South. He sees warfare. He sees all of this, all of that as something that's kind of bad. And it's from this perspective that he sees the industrializing United States. He sees the rapid urbanization that's happening. Cities are building, the proletarianization of workers. You have thousands and thousands of workers in cities. And he sees the potential for this to go badly as something that you match with amplifying the good order of nature in the cities. Or at least I think that's what he's doing from reading him. But he's obsessed with organization. He's absolutely obsessed with it. He writes about how he doesn't do well with ambiguity, and he's actually kind of a notoriously difficult person to work with. And he quits his job at the sanitary commission because he's getting in fights with everybody all the time, because they're not working like the kind of machine that he wants to. Humans are ambiguous and all this kind of stuff, and in a lot of ways nature isn't ambiguous in that in its kind of innate goodness to him.
A minute ago, and I don't know if he's still here, I saw Michael Lee, and is Michael still here? Yeah. I know it's not fair to put you on notice, but maybe we can, because I know you've been thinking a lot about order and organization in German landscape practice at the same time, and Linné's practice. And so like in 10 minutes or so, when we bring mics up to the audience, maybe we can ask you to think about how these two might be related, because I do feel like this is something that the two of you have started to explore in different contexts, which really sheds light on, I think, something that Sarah Zodi has called to our attention, which is the shift from Olmsted's practice to that of his sons. and what happens when the order and organization of a profession and its skill and technical expertise maybe takes over from some of the social aspirations and political intentions that may have been part of an early practice. So anyway, it's like on the back of my mind. I've got maybe one more question before shifting to the audience.
Beth, can I just make a quick comment?
Yeah,
on
please
that?
do, yeah.
In Louisville and many other cities, when parks became officially by law segregated during the Jim Crow era, the successor firm, Olmsted Brothers and Olmsted Associates, was invited to design parks that were intentionally created for Black citizens. And what's really interesting in the literature is that the Sons make hardly any reference to race at all. They take the jobs. In Louisville, it was a creation of Chickasaw Park, which is a sort of a little sister to Shawnee Park, crammed with all the same kind of amenities in a much smaller space, of course. And most of that didn't get built as designed, but, and they also designed another park, Algonquin. But there's no discussion of whether or not to take this job, or how does this jive with the sort of moral compass of the firm. And it's something that Arlene Levy has been looking into quite a bit, but she's found very few written references, and the ones she's found do not put the Sons in a very positive light. Very interesting.
And do you remember the decade that
The 20s.
so in the 1920s? Yeah. So by that point, Olmsted Senior has been dead for 20 years. And
John
and
had
they are
just
quite,
died.
and so the son is at that point finally like in the maturity of his career. Yeah.
And he had
I would add to that.
big planning scale issues then in parks and public space.
Yeah. Sarah, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would add that, Olmsted Senior, he points out during his trip that the North is, in his conversations with people in the South, they point to the emerging laws in the South that segregate Black from white. And at the time, there really wasn't segregation in the South in that way. And he finds that to be a shameful part of the North and cites landscape architecture, public grounds as a way to assimilate, using his words. And so really, he finds segregation to be shameful, and he thinks that landscape architecture should be working specifically in opposition to the idea of segregation. But Junior acknowledges that, and in fact, kind of advertises landscape architecture as a tool for segregation. So there's a pretty significant shift from Senior to Junior in what the goal of landscape architecture is meant to be.
One of the aspects that I think both of you are bringing up, which are so interesting for us to begin to consider, and maybe I'll wrap this up into the last question. One thing that I picked up, Sarah Zodi, from your talk was the way in which our understanding of Olmsted puts a magnifying lens on our practices today. And I'm really struck with two things: the contrast between the aspirations for making parks that were places of reconciliation and encounters with not only spaces of nature, but different kinds of people. And then the ease with which the landscape medium can erase and suppress other stories. And Sarah, the work you're doing with your students, the square in Savannah being one example, right? The African-American burial ground in Richmond being another, reminds us how easy it is for grass and trees to be an almost invisible way of erasing history. And so I wonder, Sarah, if you could speak to how you're actually trying to toggle between the past and the present in your book, and what kind of techniques you're using, whether it's a narrative structure or diagrams, because one thing I picked up from several of you is the importance for us to have cross-scalar lenses when we're talking about parks, like what's happening here and its impacts somewhere else. But it also seems to me there's cross-time, like that a place has histories and they're not in the past, we're actually living them in the present. So Sarah, how are you trying to translate what you're seeing and learning with your students and documenting on Instagram and social media into like a traditional form of a book? And I might be giving you anxiety asking you that because it might be in progress, but it would be fun to hear you answer it.
Yeah, I mean, there's somewhat two separate projects, the work that I'm doing in the book and the work that I'm doing with my students. In the pedagogy of the class, it's really a little bit more of a experiment of what's the contemporary version of Olmsted's methodological proposition. Can we understand Cotton Kingdom not only as a historical text, but as a methodological proposition for research and practice today? And what would that look like? And so, the class, as I mentioned in the talk, students are given a site and really asked to essentially, as a parallel to what Olmsted is doing, work back and forth between what they see at the site over time, and then zoom out and finding the appropriate extents to kind of form a hypothesis about what are the factors that have created that change that they've witnessed in the physical dimension over those years. And so, there's a lot of experimentation in terms of representation and spatial analysis. Among them, they're not all radically innovative. Among them, it's pick up the phone and call someone, because these people are real. The descendants are real. They know the stories. They know the stories more than you can even imagine. And so it's been very profound to find these descendants and connect with them, have the students connect with them, and actually for them to work together to produce something that's valuable, because inevitably there is real life activism and advocacy happening on the ground across the transect of Olmsted's trip. I picked two to talk about in the lecture briefly, but I mean, there's no shortage of people fighting every day for their stories to be told. And Olmsted is a useful device. Nobody cared that there were thousands of people below that underpass, but Olmsted visited there for an afternoon. And somehow the doors open in terms of conversations with the mayor, in terms of conversations with Virginia and DOT about the expansion of the freeway, And so Olmsted is an advocate in his own right today. And so bringing him into the contemporary context has political implications. And so the visualization, be it in animation and in film and Instagram, the kind of spatial analysis that he was doing with the map, is still relevant today. And so really every project and every year I teach it, I've seen, new experimentation about how to visualize these stories, in the way that the landscape itself is obscuring. In relationship to the conversation or the previous question, I wanted to add one note that I forgot to, which is that in 1853 Olmsted visits the Rochester National Colored Convention, and Frederick Douglass is speaking, and he says that he's so taken with the level of culture and class and self-determination that he witnesses there, that he's never seen a gathering of people so smart, so intelligent, Black or white, which I found pretty funny. But it brings him to the conclusion that, landscapes should be devoted to basically challenging one of the central arguments for slavery, which is the inefficiency of Negroes to take care of themselves. And so landscapes have the responsibility to demonstrate the natural abilities of the Negro. And I, to your point, Beth, about what this means for landscape architecture, I mean, it's pretty clear that we have, when I hear him talking so explicitly about what the goal is, in using those words exactly, it just brings to my mind even more how far off we are in our contemporary discourse in landscape architecture, and the kind of mantle that we've left.
Thanks, Sarah. You just hit on a couple of fascinating sites that resonate. Some of you know that Hannah Brown in our program is going to do a thesis project this year on that burial ground site that you looked at in Richmond. And she's working with the descendant group, Lenora McQueen. And UVA started to get involved, and that's how we heard about this site, and then realized it was one of the ones you had looked at, because this cross-scalar set of relationships between a burial ground in Richmond and UVA allows us to realize that bodies traveled between those two places, and the anatomical theater at UVA needed cadavers, and UVA paid people to rob graves, usually Black graves in Richmond. So UVA's provost office is interested in trying to help that descendant group right now. And so, just know the work that your students are doing is rippling and empowering descendant groups around the country in ways that I think are reframing history and also contemporary practice. So super exciting. And then now I've got to learn more about Rochester, where my parents were born and my family was from. I think I didn't realize Olmsted had spent some time there too. Okay, we've got time for questions from the audience, and Dick and Natalie are going to carry the mic around. So definitely Michael Lee is on this hot spot. Maybe we can start with him with a comment, and then that'll allow others in the audience to gather their thoughts and ask questions of our participants.
Can you hear through the mask? Okay, good. I was very interested with the comments about thinking of Olmsted as an organizer and an administrator. For the past few years, I've been working on a book project on the German landscape designer Peter Joseph Linné, who's basically one generation prior to Olmsted. He had a 5-decade career working for the kings of Prussia, beginning in 1816 and then going to 1866. That's a sense of dates. It's interesting to me that his career commences right as the Napoleonic Wars have ended. And in fact, this is marking, the reemergence of Prussia, the German province he was in, into really the 19th century. So there's a very similar parallel in terms of dealing with the trauma of war in this case. But he was working with a concept that I would call is aesthetic industrialization as part of this larger administrative effort on the part of the Prussian government to push their economy forward and make it more efficient. They were explicitly and consciously avoiding what they saw as the ills of industrialization in England. They were going to do something different in Prussia and actually focused on urban areas for the new factories and businesses, but rural areas, dispersing them in the landscape in a designed way to take a totally different path. Never really materialized in that way, but Linné, in his own work, which encompassed parks, royal projects, but also a lot in the public realm in Berlin after 1840. So he's got this in the back of his mind because he's working with these other administrators. He was a high-ranking administrator in the government. He's incorporating steam power, into these landscapes for fountains and for irrigation. He's doing infrastructure projects, essentially aestheticizing railroad corridors through plantings, doing the same thing with canals. So he's thinking these broad terms. And I was thinking about agriculture too, because there's one project he does in the 1820s with high-ranking official in the Prussian government who had an estate of about 1,000 acres in what is now Poland. And there's this amazing essay that they co-write, giving the entire rationale of the organization or reorganization of this estate. And it's in two halves. There's the economic half and there's the aesthetic half. And the economic half comes first, as in all of this administrative thinking. And even down to how do we move the sheep through this estate from section to section so that the wool does not get dirty on the way. And how they can feed in clover as they move from one paddock to the other. But the idea then is to, through visual means, sort of somehow unify this economic imperative and make it look effortless, as if it were a park. And he's actually importing the same conventions he's doing in the royal parks and even in the public parks in Berlin at that time. So it's fascinating to me that they were very aware of this dichotomy, almost schizophrenia, in the imperatives of how to produce the right kind of order going forward with this economic organization that kind of gets buried or disguised behind these other conventions that they're consumed really as a unified aesthetic vision and trying to make this look absolutely effortless. So I'm really interested in thinking more about now Olmsted in these terms, especially in relationship to agriculture and the agricultural landscape, because I'm seeing, I'd say, similar or at least analogous ways of administrative creation of order, in the landscape, often from a very centralized place of government, and then those effects as they actually get played out.
Can I respond? Michael, this is fascinating, and I want to talk more with you about it, but it made me think of the book that I'm writing right now, which is also about it. It's basically a reconstruction book after a war. How do you rebuild? So it sounds like parallel to the Prussian state is interested in rebuilding a version of itself in the ashes of Napoleon. And I think it will tie into what you asked earlier about the professions and how the professions see themselves as basically agents of order. And American engineers after the Civil War, and Olmsted is a kindred spirit in kind of way. They've seen not only the destruction of the war, but also the incredible state building capacity of the United States. So the Yankee Leviathan turns into this big centralized government. And then all of a sudden, all the previous limits that they had felt about what could be achieved seem to evaporate. And all of a sudden they're designing things like, we're going to build railroads across the entire continent. We're going to remake the entire Mississippi River. We're going to, build a canal, not only across Florida, but we're going to build a canal across the Appalachian Mountains. We're going to do all of these things. We're going to tinker with the very material of the United States. It's water, it's land, all of this kind of stuff. And we're going to organize it according to admittedly a less aestheticized fashion than what you're describing. Because I think that they get pleasure out of seeing the machine start working, the machine of industrialization start working. And I collect, yesterday I went, there are two engineers who have their papers in the special collections here, and I went and looked at them. And it's funny how they all take photographs of exactly the same thing. They love photographing giant piles of mud and like a piece of railroad or a bridge, and then just like raw destruction around it. And I think they like the rawness of it. They appreciate the power that they are able to have over these vast parts of the landscape. Now that they're like that humans didn't have beforehand, steam power, all this stuff didn't have beforehand. I think Olmsted is a kindred spirit, except that he doesn't like the rawness like the engineers do. He sees that as having a cutting edge against, like the goodness of the world. And I think that motivates him too. But I'm excited to talk more about this.
Okay, Dick's asked me to move up here since I don't have a mic anymore. And I got some backup questions, but we'd love some questions from the audience if there are some. I see a hand up. Yeah. And if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, that would be great.
I can't because I might embarrass people with me. So just ask my questions. I watched your programs the other day, and I wondered what you think Olmsted or landscape people today would do about the following. In August, Central Park was flooded because of climate change. Most of our country is being flooded, and it looks like if Olmsted were around, he'd be dealing with something similar to the bogs that you described in Central Park. I wondered what creative landscape work could be done in connection with solving these problems with climate change, where our cities are going to be modified. And in many cases, this is a civil rights problem because the initial settlers of most of our cities who were in the urban areas that were high were succeeded by people who lived on the coast that now want to move back into the urban areas that are high, which will force people out in the way you described with the Seneca situation. And secondly, just to add to the complication of this question, in August in 2017, there was a famous march across one of the, I think, most important parks in America, which was the Lawn here in Charlottesville. And it converted that into politically a military landscape. I wonder what could be done to restore the positive image of the University of Virginia and the Lawn in terms of what Olmsted or people in your field might suggest.
Those are two great questions. Any of our speakers want to start with the climate change one? And I know it's always hard to imagine what a historical figure might have done 160 some years later, but I think you could probably just talk about you as a.
I can speak to that somewhat. Again, going back to the work in Louisville, thanks to Charles Beveridge, the great Olmsted scholar, he helped us understand Olmsted's design intent. And in Louisville, which was his last major park system, it's considered his most scenic work of design because he worked more with the landscape that he received and didn't do major changes to it. But there's a 45-acre knob-top savanna. In other words, it's perched up on a hilltop that Olmsted had seen as the most wild place available within the city of Louisville, with fabulous views. And it had been maintained naturally by lightning strikes or created by lightning strikes, then maintained by Native Americans who camped there waiting for the bison to come down into the Ohio Valley. And Olmsted designed a series of carriage drives around this hilltop to give you that experience of wildness. And most of those drives weren't built. And then over time during the 20th century, that area became the site of Boy Scout camporees, cornfields, industrialized mowing. But the fact is, it's a perched water table. And so it was wet. There were crayfish there, 300 feet elevation. And there was a tremendous flooding problem in the surrounding neighborhood. And so the project there was to recreate or restore the savanna, an oak savanna, and use the Olmsted drive alignments for a mown path system with rustic shelters and rustic benches. And then there would be 4 watersheds that start at the top of this hill. And each one had a series of wetlands, dry wetlands and permanent wetlands. Anyway, it was an ecological response to an existing problem of flooding, which proved very successful. Immediately after that project was completed, the flooding in the surrounding neighborhood stopped. And within a year, the hilltop was repopulated with an extraordinary amount of wildlife, bird life, and it's been very successful. It's been out there now for almost 25 years and very resilient. And so that was a case of understanding Olmsted's intent, understanding the contemporary problem of water or opportunity of water, and kind of giving it its place back in the landscape in a functional way that's also very beautiful. And I think that there are other, in Pittsburgh, there's a small lagoon that the Olmsted brothers designed for the Mellon estate that happens to be, I'm sure it was put in this estate landscape for a functional reason, because of its location, but it's very close to a former stream tributary to the Allegheny River, which has become the focus of a big watershed wide planning effort. And so and it's absent now, bringing this pond back and reinterpreting it in terms of bringing the old stream back to life, and a whole series of moves along this stream valley is something that people are starting to get excited about, to see the possibilities. So that's more of a reinterpretation of Olmsted's original design, of the Olmsted's original design response to a contemporary need, all of which, flows into climate change and how we manage at least water in our built areas.
I think those are two terrific examples of ways that contemporary communities and designers have interpreted Olmsted's work. And I might just offer a third. When the Olmsted Forum worked on the Boston Park system, and particularly the Back Bay, creating the Boston Fens, that was in direct response to huge flooding problems in Boston that were created as developers filled the Charles River in order to expand the city. And as they started to imagine a new park that was based on a fens, on a water landscape, and not a meadow or a wood, something that was more conventional, Olmsted feared that the public would not know what to make of it because it didn't fit into an aesthetic category that was known. But the importance of doing that, right, of realizing that was an important role that landscape could adopt, which was remediating some of these environmental challenges. And so I think it reminds us of the importance of innovation and not always following clients' tastes, but helping bring them along so that they understand that the work has to meet today's challenges, not yesterday's. I'll just add that there's a conference in New York on the 15th of October called Courageous by Design that is all about climate change and landscape architecture and the work of contemporary landscape architects in New York. And it's sponsored by the Cultural Landscape Foundation. So there's some good examples, I think, that will be shared at that event, which maybe not described as in the spirit of Olmsted, are definitely a group of kindred, courageous designers.
I'll add too that one of the things that Olmsted is making a case for is the core environmental practices that are rooted in slavery. And he notes, in fact, the impacts on erosion and flooding, particularly in the lower Mississippi River Valley, and calls attention to the sort of flattening of the landscape, the removal of significant biodiversity in view of very short-term profit motivations that, in his words, basically obscure our ability to calculate not only economically and socially and culturally in the ways that we've been talking about to this point in the afternoon, but also environmentally, that there's an ecological corruption or that is embedded in slavery. And Walter Johnson in his book also writes a whole chapter called Dominion, and it's about our relationship to nature as a function of slavery. And the ways in which, that chapter in particular, and linking that with Olmsted's observations of flooding and erosion, and as extensively as he writes about economics, he's also writing about poor soil management practices, and he's appalled at the ways in which everything from Western expansion is driven entirely by cotton. And the poor soil management as it relates to the amount of forced labor that's being used to harvest it. So, you know, again, it's tricky to say what would a historical figure say or do in a time like this, but the threads are there certainly. And it's one of the things that he calls our attention to 165 years ago.
Anybody want to pick up on the 2017 issues, which I know those of us in Charlottesville know a lot better than everyone here, but I think everybody knows what happened in Charlottesville on August.
I
20.
want to thank Sarah just for including Malcolm X in your lecture. The inclusion of Malcolm X and how he inspired, how Olmsted helped to inspire his own sense of leadership, I thought was wonderful, and I had no idea about that.
I'll talk about 2017. I mean, it was hard, as someone who was an undergraduate here, to see Charlottesville on television that way was just it was just devastating. And it shows how quickly spaces can be turned into absolutely menacing, threatening places. I think Olmsted would have responded to it. Well, he would have said that this is precisely what he saw in the South was white supremacy, was weaponized, was everywhere, was omnipresent, and was something that at all costs needed to be defeated. I don't know if he would have thought that it could. He may have made the case to say that it was a design problem, or it could be addressed with design, but it's primarily a political problem. And his way of dealing with white supremacists when he talked to them, because he talked to a lot of them when he was traveling in the South, was really interesting journalistically. I imagine him as just kind of being deadpan and letting them talk and talk and talk and talk and get comfortable and eventually reveal how completely demented and deranged they were, and then recording it and publishing it. And a lot of his talks with people, where he's just asking them, okay, so how do you make them work? Or how do you increase the efficiency? And then he records very faithfully these like completely deranged responses that people give. You know, the journalistic effect is interesting because his work on the South is more widely cited than the kind of thundering moralizing that like Horace Greeley was doing in the New York Tribune, where he just maudlin, emotional sermonizing in that newspaper. The New York Times hired Olmsted because he was going to do this kind of deadpan journalism and actually reveal the conditions in the South without kind of sermonizing on top of it. So, you know, I don't know how to answer the question about how you kind of remove that stain. I think it's going to be part of the history of this place, and it's a good reminder that those forces are out there, and that, you know, the Civil War didn't end the problem that was created, you know, or that has been created in this country because of racialized slavery. But I think that there is something to learn about about just kind of being deadpan and letting the kind of utter derangement of these views, you know, be present so that people are aware of them. That might have been part of his way of addressing it. But again, I'm not totally sure.
I don't, oh,
Sarah, did you want to add one more thing about that? Yeah. And then
yeah,
Patty.
I would just add that, I mean, you know, Olmsted would have probably yawned on, you know, on August. I mean, it's, he's the extent of the vile treatment of humans that he saw, probably would not be surprised at where we're at. You know, and because we haven't done much to resolve it in the way that he felt was necessary. So, and you know, and in that way, that park is no different than any other park, you know, in terms of the history that it represents. It's no different than any other street, any other city, any other building. That you know, the land in that sit on, broadly speaking, in this country, all exhibits a really wide range of really intense, really hateful, really cool behavior. That's not specific to a day or a park. And so the question that you ask is really the central question in my mind, resolving the historical histories, setting us on a path to resolve them both symbolically and systematically, and also addressing the question of resilience of the society, but also of the environment. So, I mean, your question is as much about a specific day and a specific park as it is really about the larger issues at hand.
Great, thanks. Yeah, well, Susan, I didn't want to put you on the spot too much, but I wonder if you could just speak so eloquently, as I know you can, about your visit this morning to the memorial to enslaved laborers, which is 100 yards away from where those people marched with torches.
Well, it's a remarkable place. And one of the descendants was being interviewed for a documentary when we were there. And we got a chance to meet her and talk with her some, which was really fantastic. What was really interesting to me was learning about how one aspect of the design concept became so controversial, which was the tree planting to create shade and I guess to hearken back to the groves, and then how with the high emotions and sometimes strident or just very deeply concerned voices raised questions about hanging trees and other aspects of trying to hide the memorial and other kinds of criticisms that led to the trees being eliminated from the project. And that's a fascinating and sad, I think, dialogue series. And I would hope that over time that trees might find a way there, just because trees will make it a more humane environment. It's a hot, very exposed site, and having some more shade close by, at least, I think would be a good thing. But it's I think a quite moving concept with the names of the enslaved laborers here that could be identified, the lovely curved marks for those who couldn't, the use of their work names, a journeyman or woodworker, in cases where the names aren't known, but the occupations are. And just all of that, coupled with the textures and the role of water in the landscape and just the subtlety of the geometry of that space, and especially how the stone pieces on the outside are, I mean, it must have been a nightmare in terms of drawing it and ensuring that the pieces all actually came out and fit in this very subtle, lovely way. But I think there's a lot of texture and layers of meaning there that people can find their way into. It was also interesting to hear two other things. One, that the circle of lawn, people tend not to go on it, even though it was envisioned that would be sort of a gathering space. People tend to react to it as maybe more of a sacred space. And so they will process around the memorial along the path, but rarely go into the grass. And then the other thing that I loved was just how it's become not a UVA landscape, but a landscape of the community. And the nonprofit organization that has developed and is now taking a nationwide role in this work is remarkable. So I think it's an effort that took a lot of courage to move through those times. I understand it started before the march and it ended after the march, and was somewhat colored during that period by conflicts. But I think it's a space that is going to grow in meaning and and just become this kind of locus of connection to the past and to a more just present.
Yep, Colleen, yeah, and then I see another hand back here. So, good. You got to do the microphone thing, yeah. And then Natalie, I think this person in the green shirt for the next one.
This question about something positive that happened in our world in the past year and a half, and I would say that all over the world, people have sought solace in public outdoor spaces. And I'm curious if any of our panelists have been able to focus on that, and perhaps the concept of public access to outdoor spaces worldwide, especially in urban areas, might breathe new life into interest in Olmsted's work and his visions, and how spot on he was for urban dwellers in needing to have this space and access to that. So just wondering if that spurred anything in any of our panelists' diversions from the work they're working on.
Yeah, it'd be great because the four of you have, well, the two Sarahs have New York landscapes, but I know you've also been in other places. And then we've got Pittsburgh and Columbus. So different urban experiences. Anybody want to start as a responding to that one?
I'm happy to jump in. Well, first of all, just my experience in parks leadership has shown me the many times that people have come together spontaneously. Well, when John Lennon was murdered, there was a huge gathering in Cherokee Park, and it was completely spontaneous. It was before flash mobs, and somehow the word got out, and it was quite a beautiful. It was quite a beautiful time. After September 11th, it was very clear that the parks, much as in the pandemic period, that people were coming out to these landscapes more and seeking solace and the reassurance of other people. It's clearly a function of civics. An important function of civic space is grieving together, experiencing together, healing together. And, I think it's quite clear the need is as great as it ever was for precisely that approach. And I don't think there's any real genius to providing it either. I mean, it will take place whether or not a place is provided for it. But if you're thoughtful about, as Olmsted was, about providing places for very large groups of people to congregate, some thought should be given to providing those kinds of spaces in public parks. And I think quite often that's overlooked, the need to really support large and unorganized, unmanaged civic gatherings.
Either of the Sarahs want to talk about your experiences during the pandemic and what you've learned about coming together in public spaces and the value of immersive interactions with nature during this troubled year and a half?
Well, of course, Central Park has once again become the refuge that it was built to be by Olmsted and Fox. And when all of the doors of all the cultural institutions were closed, Central Park was open and welcoming to everybody. There were, of course, problems with people getting too close and people without masks and all of that. But I think that it's been tremendously gratifying to see how many people no longer take Central Park for granted, or any of the parks. They realized that was the only place to go. And where would they go if they didn't have these, wonderful urban parks designed by Olmsted or by anyone? And so I think it makes people who once took them for granted really appreciate that they exist. And I can say certainly from the Conservancy that membership was very much up, because people just never thought about the fact that they had to contribute, whether it was volunteering or cleaning or donating money. And that changed. The COVID changed everything there. So let's hope it continues and yet hope the virus is no longer a problem.
A footnote, one thing that we've been arguing about in terms of new park work in existing historic parks is path width. So the city would like to reduce path widths because they actually remove the snow, which is amazing, from main paths in our parks, which I've never seen before. But they would like to narrow the paths and you know, to save money on a project. People are asking me, well, can we take this 10-foot path to an 8-foot or a 6-foot? And, you know, the really wide 10 and 12-foot paths that were designed, and Sarah knows this better than I do, but they were designed for lots of people to be promenading, passing each other, coming and going, and for the voluminous clothes that women were wearing. I mean, you had to have path width. Now we need path width for wheelchairs, which are getting wider. But the idea of reducing a 10-foot path to an 8 or 6-foot path, I think, is very much going in the wrong direction. You know, there are path materials that we can use that are more environmentally responsible, and they don't have to be impervious paths. But I think we're going to need that kind of width. I feel like the social distancing instinct has been born in this period. And I know myself, when I'm out and about, if I get closer than 6 feet to someone just casually, I feel like I need to pull back. I don't know if you all are feeling that, but you know, it's interesting. And so I don't think we should be diminishing the infrastructure that supports the public use of parks.
I just realized now with this question that I've been doing a little bit of an Olmsted project myself, where I'm a New Yorker in the Midwest, and realizing how the Midwest is deeply strange to a lot of things that that I just take for granted and I like it. I like Ohio, but it is very different from New York, just the way that people think about spaces. And it's also strange, like going to the beach in Ohio is we go to a huge reservoir. The Corps of Engineers built this huge dam, this huge reservoir, and then they dumped a bunch of sand on and we're at the beach, right? And so it's different, but how suburban Ohio is and how suburban much of America is really striking to me in people's habits and the way that they think about just what they do. And I'm married into a very large Mexican-American family with, you know, a gazillion cousins. And what we do on the weekends is we go out to a park and they cook at the park, and there's like, everyone's there. It's like 50 people and the kids go crazy, and there's soccer, and, you know, Michelle's aunt brings out this giant thing for cooking, and it's like, we could do this in a backyard, but no, we don't. We go out to a park to do this. And so I, you know, see parks as there are very strong kind of ethnic and especially social class divides in this country about who uses parks. And that's changing with at least in Ohio, it's changed with the pandemic, where you have wealthy suburban people who have everything that they need in their little plot of land, except for social interaction or just being around other people. And so all of a sudden that you know, the public parks where the majority of people are Latino at these parks using them, all of a sudden aren't all Latino anymore, where there are other people that are there and are like, oh, look, this is a important thing. This public space is an important thing. that I need or I'm kind of drawn to. So I'm hopeful that the increase in people's cognizance of these public places, of even beaches in the Midwest, will lead to more attention being paid to them, and a kind of stronger sense that public investment in these places is a really important thing.
We've got green shirt person's question. And just before you get going, just it seems to me that all of you are making the case for what Olmsted called unstructured recreation, which is an important thing for us to remember as city residents or suburban residents, because Parks and Rec can think that parks are all about play and programming, and the space for interaction with each other and with strangers and with nature is maybe as important or more today. Yeah. Great.
Yes, thank you. My name is Green Shirt Person. And no, my name is Salma. I am a first year MLA student here. Don't have really any background in design. And I missed most of the talks, unfortunately. I was in studio, but got to hear many of the questions and comments. And one of the things that I was thinking about was one of the first questions that Beth asked with regards that you answered. I apologize, I don't know your name. With regards to like how Olmsted was thinking, like how he related to building or designing spaces in terms of particularly like how he doesn't like ambiguity. And I took that to mean like moral ambiguity, which may not be correct, but it also like got me thinking about how like motivation and intention is baked into the physicality of the design and like of a space generally. And so I'm wondering like how the essence of a space is that has been created by that has been created by like the intention and by the motivation and morality of a specific designer, like how that actually manifests physically with like physical elements, or how that might look. It's a really broad question. I don't know what direction you might want to take that, but it's something I'm really curious about as I start to design and think about how to design spaces myself.
Oh, babe. It is an impossible question to answer, but I think there are a couple of things that I think about when you're asking about how do we know the intentions, and how long do those intentions last in a particular landscape? And as a historian, it's always a question of interpretation, right? Is that using these landscapes, we are constantly interpreting them. And in fact, that's what history is. It's the constant reinterpretation of the facts of the past. It's not something that's in a book and it's done. It's something that you do. You tell stories, you construct narratives about what does this place mean, and how is it meaningful to us? And so I think that the power of Olmsted is that, and why he's so compelling, that every generation kind of rediscovers Olmsted. They rediscover his social mission. They rediscover all the interesting things about his life, is because those principles are somehow durable in that form. And I don't know if it's a particular design decision about making a path this way or that way. But the principles are apparent if you look at it. And most people, it's funny in history, a lot of my colleagues only know Olmsted because of his work in the South. And then they say, do you know he designed Central Park? And they go, what? I had no idea. And so the desire to kind of not just take form for or see form as just an exercise that is internal to itself, has its own kind of internal logics, but to constantly be questioning what the narrative is of this and why things ended up this way is that kind of answer. I don't know if Olmsted set out to make interpretable landscapes. I don't know if that's what he did, but it certainly is there. We can see it. We can read it.
I know I'm going to need to also pull some things together so we don't go over. So
I just want to say one thing
Go
really
on.
quickly. I
Yeah.
want to push back, or at least maybe go a little further with this question of ambiguity. I understand the context that you used it in, but I do want to say that Olmsted was a tremendously subtle designer. And just as one example of ambiguity and how it works in his design aesthetic is the experience that he wanted people to have of moving along the edge. He really detested the sharp edge between mown lawn and woodlands. So he wanted there to be an intermediate zone, which of course we know there should be anyway, ecologically speaking. But he wanted people to be able to move in and out of the edge of the woodlands and into the sunny space and back into the woodlands, so that there was a very ambiguous edge, indeterminate edge, I think is the term that he used, because a great deal of that scenic design immersion experience was about leading you by the nose, through the landscape, using cues that are going to pull you forward or grab your attention or what have you. So I understand, I think, what you were saying, but I just want to make that design point. I think it's important.
yeah, I mean, this conversation, I'll tell you what I've loved about Zoom, Sarah and real life, Susan and John and colleagues here. The idea of being able to hear these lectures, on our own, eating, drinking coffee, and then actually hearing people talk about the issues, to me has been invigorating and a lot more productive than sitting in a room hearing a lecture. So I've loved that. And to the students in the room, I hope we can continue these conversations in the hall. And, if you want to follow up over lunch and things like that. I want to get back to the question that you asked, which I think is really germane on so many levels as a concluding remark, thinking about durable principles. I mean, Olmsted was basing his ideas not only on landscape aesthetic theory, but books by physicians like Zimmerman in his writing on solitude. He had a sense that there was evidence that nature immersion affected well-being. And today, we have amazing colleagues like Jenny Rowe in the planning department, who's both a landscape architect and an environmental psychologist, doing evidence-based research with sensors tracking cortisol levels and stress reduction of different kinds of people, not all human beings, but rich and poor, male and female, wealthy and poor, and how nature immersion affects them differently, all positively, but differently. So I think one way to think about this is not to get caught up in how do I know that my intentions are interpreted or read by others, but to stay abreast with contemporary thought and research, and to realize that your work is always going to be a designed experiment. It's not going to be the solution to anything. To be humble enough about what you're experimenting with, but to be audacious enough that it has and makes an impact. Speaking of audaciousness, and I don't know, Kim, how you feel about this. I know some people at 5 will need to leave, but I'm really interested in seeing the video that you've got queued up about a park in Charlottesville. It's a short little 10-ish minute thing that the Garden Club has been working on to install the first phase of a bog garden. And they're super interested in the kinds of coalitions that could be built in the future with both student groups, local schools, and other community groups. So I think what we might do to provide a segue is to use this minute to thank the Sarahs if they need to skedaddle to next things, to thank everybody for being here. And then if folks need to leave, they can, but if they want to stay, I know I do, for a follow-up that we can talk about the bog garden for a little bit. So Sarah Cedar Miller, Sarah Zodi, Susan Rademacher, and John Davis, thank you so much for your brilliance, your courage, and your generosity with us, and for the audience for being here today. Big thanks.